Order. I call Rachel Reeves to ask her urgent question. Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To ask the Minister for the Cabinet Office if he will make a statement on the recent judicial review ruling which found that the government had acted unlawfully in respect of COVID contracts.
Minister Edder.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Protecting those who protect us has been one of the government's most important goals in our fight against COVID-19. To do this, we've had to expand our PPE supply chain from supplying 226 NHS trusts in England to supplying over 58,000 different settings, and we've had to create a whole new logistics network from scratch. Thanks to the hard work and dedication of so many people, we've delivered over 8.6 billion items of PPE to the front line so far, with billions more ordered and being supplied. Our team worked night and day to procure PPE within very short timescales and against a background of unparalleled global demand. This often meant working at incredible speed, especially in the early months of the pandemic, to secure the vital supplies required to protect NHS workers and the public, which we did. Mr Speaker, turning specifically to the High Court judgment, there has been a lot of confusion about what this ruling actually said and what it did not say, and I welcome the opportunity to clarify that to the House today. The High Court case did not look at the awarding of the contracts, but rather the timing of the publication of the details of contracts awarded. The Court ruled that at this time of unprecedented pressure, contract award notices were not all published in the timescales required by the regulations. However, the Court also found there was no deprioritisation policy in this respect within the Department. As we set out to the Court, the delays were caused by the workload involved in responding to one of the greatest threats to public health that this country has ever seen. Of course, Mr Speaker, we take our transparency requirements very seriously, and it is important that I put on record that we, of course, take the judgment of the Court very seriously and respect it. We are working with colleagues across government to implement the recommendations set out in the Right Honourable Lady's report, the PAC report published earlier this month. But as we do this, we will keep acting quickly and decisively to respond to this deadly threat and to continue to do all that we can to help save lives.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A stain has emerged with this government's response to the crisis. There has been an unedifying gold rush of chums and of chancers. £2 billion worth of contracts handed to those with close links to the Conservative Party. From the pub landlord of the Health Secretary, to the donors, the manifesto writers, the Old Boys Club, they've all had a return on their investment at all of our expense. The government has been taken to court, and they lost, costing taxpayers even more money. Now, the Home Secretary once said that she wanted people to literally feel the terror at the thought of committing offences. Well, the Home Secretary doesn't have to look to the streets to find lawbreakers. She only has to look across the Cabinet table. This government aren't terrified of breaking the law because they think they are above the law. Absolutely. But now the government have lost in court. So can I ask the Minister, what were the costs to taxpayers for fighting this case? Will the government agree today to publish the names of all businesses in their VIP fast lane and how they got on that list? Will all overdue contracts be published by the end of this week? When will the management consultants hired locate the billions of pounds of PPE that the government seem to have misplaced? And when will the clawback be used to get taxpayers' money back for contracts that have failed to deliver? And will the Minister take this opportunity to apologise to the doctors and nurses, the care workers and other frontline workers who did not have the PPE that they needed and had to make makeshift PPE because, unlike what the Health Secretary has said, there was a shortage in PPE and those who were working on the front line were not protected. And while he is here, will the Minister, as Serco's former head of public affairs, reveal the mystery of why the government created Serco Test and Trace rather than a true NHS test and trace, embedded in our communities? Mr Speaker, NHS workers, care workers and taxpayers deserve better. We deserve the end of crony contracts from this government.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, notwithstanding the circumstances and the approach adopted by the Honourable Lady, I will say it's a pleasure to appear at the dispatch box for the first time opposite her. She raised a number of specific points, but before I turn to them, I have to reiterate what this judgment in this case did and didn't do. This judgment focused on timely production or publication of contract notices. It did not make any judgment or consider in any way the appropriateness of the contracting process or any of the individual processes. In respect of her point, she alleges impropriety and inappropriate behaviour. Wrong. The NAO report was absolutely clear that there was no evidence of any inappropriate behaviour, and indeed no court has found this. I would highlight to her that the judgment was a declaratory judgment. It stated what had happened, that there had been a breach of the section of Regulation 50 requirements, and the judge, if I recall, subsequently highlighted in paragraph 149 of his judgment, but the overall picture shows the Secretary of State moving close to complete compliance. He goes on to say, the evidence as a whole suggests that the backlog arose largely in the first few months of the pandemic and that officials began to bear down on it during the autumn of 2020. I would remind the House, Mr. Speaker, and indeed the Honourable Lady, of the situation that we faced back in April. 3,301 people in mechanical ventilation beds, 21,307 people in hospital with COVID. And at the beginning of April, according to our best understanding of positive cases at the time, the average number of positive cases and patients in hospital was doubling every 7 days. In those circumstances, I make no apologies that the government did everything in its power to ensure the NHS and frontline workers did not run out of PPE. And as the NAO has acknowledged, there was no national shortage of PPE at that time and throughout this pandemic. The Honourable Lady raised a number of other questions. She talked about the current situation in terms of publication and compliance and cost. What I would say to her, and I did briefly mention this to her before, is that there is an element of this case that is yet to be concluded, which is due to be on Friday when information is provided to the judge. We are doing exactly that, and that will be made public at that time when it goes to the court, respecting the role of the court in this process. But of course the judge, I would expect, would make that published in a couple of days' time. In terms of the priority route, I know, well, indeed, if I recall correctly, I think many members of this House from both sides requested expeditious consideration of requests or offers of help. I am grateful to all who offered their help. Every one of those went through an 8-stage process run by civil servants, entirely appropriately checking appropriateness of the PPE, appropriateness of the organisation to supply it, and conducting due diligence. Indeed, if I recall, the Honourable Lady herself on the 22nd of April published a letter that she sent to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, helpfully analysed at the time by the Guido Fawkes website, sharing some of her suggestions for companies or individuals that should be put through rapid assessment. And I acknowledge she said for assessment and due diligence, but she asked that they be assessed rapidly. I believe many members of this House took the same approach. But in that letter, the Honourable Lady concluded by saying, we need government to strain every sinew and utilise untapped resources in UK manufacturing to deliver essential equipment to frontline workers. This must be a national effort which leaves no stone unturned. She was right. I agreed with her sentiment then, and I still do. My only challenge is that the Honourable Lady no longer appears to agree with herself, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, I think we understand the point is the judgment over the timescale and not meeting the regulation for all the contracts. I think that it would be good for the House to hear how far the supply of PPE equipment now comes from this country rather than from abroad. And can I put it to the Minister that were I a Minister myself, an official said, we can either get more ventilators, more PPE, or we can make sure we don't fail any of the regulation timescales, I'd have said, I as the Minister will take responsibility for the failure on the timescales, and you can take responsibility for getting the equipment that people need. Hear, hear.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. In respect of his first question, at the start of this pandemic, roughly 1% of the PPE used in this country, in this setting, was produced in this country due to the incredible effort by businesses and individuals across this country, and I have to say, by civil servants and officials in government who are often the unsung heroes of this pandemic. That is now up to 70% being supplied by this country. And he's absolutely right. Of course transparency is important. Transparency is hugely important, and we respect that and take it very seriously. But I make no apologies for the thing which I consider, the Secretary of State considers to be most important, which is doing whatever is necessary to save lives in the course of this pandemic.
Let's head to SNP spokesperson Stuart Halsey. Stuart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Minister mentioned transparency, because of the £15 billion of PPE contracts awarded up until last October, barely £3 billion were properly published. And we had £252 million given to a finance company, £108 million to a confectionery supplier, £345 million to a pest control company, a catalogue of cronyism described variously as a wholesale failure, a dismal failure, and a historic failure, a process which deprioritised compliance and has ended up with the taxpayer, in some cases, buying expensive, unusable PPE. Now, ultimately, the Cabinet Office is responsible for the coordination of the cross-government response to COVID-19. So let me ask this Minister, when was the Minister for the Cabinet Office, and indeed the Prime Minister, first made aware that failure to properly publish details of PPE contracts might be unlawful?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He will appreciate that some of the contracts, which some colleagues have alluded to, remain subject to separate litigation before the courts. Indeed, some by the Good Law Project, which, if I may, I suspect it may come up a number of times, I'll refer to as the GPL project, because it might save a few minutes in these answers. So I hope you will understand I will avoid straying into something that may still be before the courts, because I don't want to show any disrespect for that process or for the legal process. He talked about the number published and where we've got to now. That will be some of the information put before the judge on Friday, as per his request. But the latest figures that are in the public domain that were supplied and covered in the judgment, and indeed more broadly, I think 100% of the CANS notices have been published, and I think we're up to 99% under Regulation 108 in the latest figures I have. So as the judge said, the overall picture does show the Secretary of State moving close to complete compliance. In respect of his broader point, I would expect that ministers in both my department, which is why I'm here, but also ministers in the Cabinet Office will have followed this process very closely.
William Bragg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and in welcoming my honourable friend to the dispatch box, I hope that the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster wasn't too indisposed cooking up plans for domestic COVID passports that he's previously ruled out them to attend the House today. But I think most fair-minded people will look at this situation in the round and perhaps give the government the benefit of the doubt, because the judgment found against the allegation of secret deprioritisation policy to deliberately breach procurement rules. And further to the question from our honourable friend, the Father of the House, can my honourable friend give greater detail of the extent of the increase in domestic production of PPE in this country so that we have security of the supply?
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. He's absolutely right. I believe that officials did do the right thing in prioritising getting the PPE that we needed for our front line. And he's absolutely right to highlight an aspect of Justice Chamberlain's judgment, which found there was no policy of deprioritising the publication of contract notices and contract data. To his final point, yes, as I said to the Father of the House, we've moved from a 1% domestically produced amount of PPE to 70% now. And to put that in context, we've supplied 8.6 billion items, and we've got over 30 billion on order or being supplied at present. I suspect, albeit as a history teacher, as a former teacher, his mental arithmetic is probably more rapid than mine in calculating that proportion as an absolute number, but I hope it illustrates to him just how much we've moved in the past year to utilise the fantastic resource that we have in manufacturing in this country.
To Sarah Owen. Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID contracts continue to literally be a matter of life and death, so the public are right to expect accountability and transparency. While nurses wore bin bags instead of proper PPE, contracts were handed out to ministers' mates. So will the minister do the right thing and in the very least reveal the 29 businesses Serco outsourced their operations to?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been very clear, and as I highlighted earlier, the NAO has been exceptionally clear that there are no suggestions of ministers behaving inappropriately in any way in the award of these contracts. And the judge did not find that in this case. It was not a factor in this case. We've been very clear to her broader point that we do believe and we fully respect transparency requirements, and we are publishing, and we have done, as I illustrated with those figures, the latest figures I put out earlier, that the department is publishing the contracts it has, and as the judge said, and I come back to it once again, the Secretary of State is moving close to complete compliance, and that is exactly what we will continue to do.
Let's head up to Lancashire with Anthony Higginbotham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At the height of the pandemic last year, the priority of the whole country was getting PPE to where it was needed on the front line. And I know I received offers of help from many businesses that I fed into the department. Could the Minister confirm, though, how many items of PPE have been delivered because of these contracts that came in over the course of last year?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. As I've said, 8.6 billion items of the contracts that were secured by the department since the start of the pandemic have been delivered, and around 3 times that number has been ordered to ensure that we continue to have delivered a robust supply to do what is the most important thing in this situation, which is to ensure that our frontline health and social care and other workers have the PPE they need to protect them.
Let's head down to Caroline Lucas. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Both the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister have repeatedly claimed that all the information relating to PPE and other COVID contracts is published online. So can you tell us very specifically where to find details about the VIP lane, including who the entrants were, what prices they were paid, and who introduced them? And on behalf of the government, will he apologise to numerous NHS and care staff who have been deeply upset by comments made by the Health Secretary yesterday, echoed in fact by himself today, that there wasn't a shortage of PPE? Does he understand why that is so insulting to the doctors who were forced to wear bin bags in the absence of gowns, and to the nurses who were wearing goggles from Screwfix?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. As I highlighted to her, we are at 100% compliance on the CAN notices. That is what the Prime Minister was referring to, the obligation to publish, and that is what we have done. And I would notice, I appreciate her interest in this case. Although the judge ruled she had no standing to bring the case, I do appreciate her long-standing interest in this matter. In respect of her point about the supply of PPE, as the NAO report highlighted, we did not run out of PPE nationally. That is not to say that there were not significant challenges in some hospitals, in some areas, around the distribution of that PPE, and that has been acknowledged throughout this pandemic. Our frontline health and social care workers did an amazing job in very challenging circumstances, and that is why it is right that civil servants across my department and others worked flat out, day and night, doing an amazing job to get the PPE that was needed. And just a final point, if I may, to the Honourable Lady. I do recognise, and I know this is very important to her, the importance of transparency and timely publication of the data. But I would also say that I would highlight the view of one of her own Green councillors in Brighton and Hove, who in a written answer recently highlighting that that council had failed to publish its financial spend figures, I think since last June, highlighting, and I quote in that answer, they have, quite rightly, his officials, prioritised paying our suppliers and producers as quickly as possible and prioritised payment of suppliers over production of information.
think we need to try and keep to the questions and not score points. Let's go to Aaron Bell, who won't want to score a point. Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as my honourable friend just did, I note from the judgment that Mr. Justice Chamberlain found that the 3 members of Parliament who sought to join this case did not have standing. He stated at paragraph 107, quote, "In a case where there is already a claimant with standing, the addition of politicians as claimants may leave the public with the impression that the proceedings are an attempt to advance a political cause." So would my honourable friend agree with me that this recent practice of trying to extend politics through court cases is actually becoming quite damaging to our democracy as a whole, particularly when technical judgment deliberately misrepresented, as seems to have happened in this case?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I, as a former Justice Minister, have huge respect for the legal process and indeed for the judgment of the courts. But he is right to highlight once again the point that the judge made in his finding that the members of this House who sought to bring this case had no standing in doing so, and that it was the GPL project that did. While I appreciate members of this House feel strongly on this issue, and understandably so, I would echo his point that I would hope that they would not seek to use the courts to make political points rather than to use them for what they are there for, which is to highlight legal issues.
Let's head over to Bell Ribeiro Addy. Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The scandal surrounding COVID contracts has not just been in the lack of transparency, but in the poor performance of these companies. 350 million to Pestfix for PPE that didn't meet the required standards, another 347 million to Randox, having failed on their original $133 million contract for distributing test kits that weren't sterile. And of course, the millions to Serco and others who failed with the track and trace system. Does the Minister agree that all public sector contracts should be held to the highest standard, no matter who their friends are? And will he outline what plans the government has to hold such contractors to account and recoup millions of public money? Or will he uphold these standards, also depending on whether the contractors have links to the Conservative Party?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, to her first point, a number of specific cases relating to specific contracts remain before the court. So if I may, I'll address her broader point about pursuing the appropriateness of the contracts, whether they can deliver, and where they fail to deliver to the appropriate standards or not, what steps the government will take. All contracts were assessed against the 8 criteria for appropriateness, including due diligence, including safety standards, including whether they meet the specifications, etc., etc. Any contract that did not deliver against that, we either refuse to pay or we will be seeking to recoup that money, and a number of investigations are already underway to fulfil that commitment. The Honourable Lady also touched on, and forgive me, I should have answered this when the Shadow Minister mentioned it, so I hope she will forgive me for coming back to it now. She touched on and made a very particular point about Serco in this context. I would just make one point to her, which I hope she will be aware of, and I'm sure she wasn't suggesting anything to the contrary. As was made very clear on the Today programme last year, I had no involvement with those contracts in any way, shape or form. Although I left the company 7 years ago, although I was never a director of that company, and although I have no ongoing links with it, so there would have been no conflict, I nonetheless had no involvement at any point in any level with those contracts, and I continue to adopt that position. I hope that's helpful to her in clarifying that point.
Right, let's head up to Stoke-on-Trent with Jonathan Gullis. Jonathan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The British people want us to fight, keep on fighting this virus, protecting our NHS, and as we roll out the vaccine and save lives. So does my honourable friend agree that the sniping from the sidelines, as the Labour Party is doing, is the opposite of what the people of Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Talk want to see right now in these unprecedented times?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognise that all members of this House and all members of the public and our constituencies want to see, and quite rightly so, transparency, but I think what is most important to them in the midst of this pandemic and as we emerge from this pandemic is that this government and those who work for it have done everything they can to ensure that we procured the PPE that was necessary when it was necessary to protect the front line and help save lives.
Let's head to Oxford with Layla Moran. Layla.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now, whether I had standing or not, I am proud to have helped bring this case alongside the members of Brighton Pavilion and Oldham East and Saddleworth. And the reason we did it was because we couldn't get the information through the normal channels available in this place. It's also worth noting that the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, rather than simply admit the breach and then promptly publish all contracts at the beginning of the process, chose to push the case to court. And then when he lost, he said he would break the law again. At the heart of the case was always transparency and fairness. Many established businesses felt frozen out because they happened not to be chums with a parliamentarian or a minister. So my question is this: can the minister not see how this looks, but also how delays in publishing these contracts in good time further undermines trust in government at a time when trust, as much as PPE, is necessary for saving lives?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Honourable Lady, and I hope she heard me highlight that although I made the legal point about lack of standing, I did acknowledge that she and two other honourable members clearly had an interest in this, and I did acknowledge her long-standing interest in this issue, in this case. She's right to highlight trust, and I think what is central to trust with the British public is the government doing everything it can to deliver for our frontline workers the protection they needed to make sure they could keep protecting us safely. The Secretary of State highlighted at the weekend, and I think this is the latest figure, that on average, the publication of notices was on average 17 days over the 30 days required, is the latest figure that the Secretary of State highlighted. I do believe it's important that transparency is adhered to, but I would also remind the Honourable Lady, I believe it's extremely important to highlight why this happens, and that is why we filed the court papers and we defended the case as we did, because I think it is hugely important for the court to see why this occurred. The government continues to do what I believe the public would expect us to do, which is on focusing on protecting the front line.
Go to Yorkshire with Craig Whittaker. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many excellent companies in the Calder Valley who wouldn't normally bid for government contracts have stood up for the national effort and have been making PPE for the national cause, even when this isn't their core business. This has secured jobs, secured business, and ensured our NHS has had the PPE when they needed it. Can my honourable friend confirm all these and other government contracts are awarded in a fair, open and transparent way, following due process, and that this government has remained committed to publishing them as quickly as possible, even under the pressures of the pandemic?
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I, like him, pay tribute to all those businesses and individuals who stepped up in this country's moment of need and were willing to put themselves forward to repurpose their factories, to try to find ways to help that national effort. All the contracts have been found so far to be awarded entirely appropriately. There has been no adverse judgment in respect of any of that. And indeed, under Regulation 32, which highlights that in an emergency, contracts can be awarded without tender, I certainly would take the view that the situation we faced with this pandemic would certainly constitute a national emergency.
Let's go to Livingston with Anna Bardell. Anna.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister tell me if it's coincidence, incompetence or just rank stupidity that his government and Health Secretary awarded a £30 million contract for testing vials to the Health Secretary's former neighbour, who was a former pub landlord and had no experience in this field and is now being investigated by the MHRA? And surely he agrees that these breaches mean the Health Secretary must resign.
Mr. Speaker, well, the Honourable Lady will not be surprised to know that I completely and utterly disagree with her. I think my right honourable friend has done and continues to do an extraordinary job under extraordinary pressure over the past year to help this country through this pandemic. She raised a very specific issue, and it has been made clear that the Health Secretary and no other minister had any involvement in the assessment, the due diligence or any decisions in respect to that contract.
Let's head to Sir Robert Neal. Sir Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The judge very clearly found that there was a breach in relation to one matter, the 17-day average delay. He rejected the suggestion that there was a systematic failure. He rejected the suggestion that there is any impropriety in the system for awarding the contracts, and did not impugn any of the contracts themselves either, or the process by which they were awarded. Most lawyers would know that was a technical breach, as has been described, albeit a breach. Isn't the real moral of this that when those of us in politics seek to comment upon judgments, it's a good idea to actually read the judgment first and understand the law about which it's based, rather than grandstanding very inaccurately, as too often been the case here?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable and learned friend, I believe, for his comments. He's absolutely right to highlight what this judgment actually said. It found, in what had to be a binary judgment, either it was complied with or it wasn't, that the government failed to comply with the 30-day publication timing for all contracts. But you're right, he absolutely... sorry, I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker. The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. He rejected the suggestion of any policy of deprioritisation, and he's also absolutely right. I read the 40 pages of Justice Chamberlain's judgment, including the setting out of the different cases put by the two parties, the discussion of it, and then, crucially, his findings on it. And I would advise all members who take an interest in this issue to do exactly the same thing, because legal judgments are rarely as clear-cut or as simple as perhaps some commentators and others might wish to suggest.
Said no to Chiomara. Chi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's infatuation with private sector delivery of pandemic public services has led it to ignore basic procurement best practice, replacing value for money with cronyism and due diligence with pub pals. Will the government commit, as Labour has done, to a programme of insourcing and start by handing over the failing Serco test and trace to the public sector, which has made such a success of the vaccine delivery?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. To her main point about private and public, and indeed I might add voluntary sector organisations, every one of those has stepped up and made a hugely important contribution to our response as a country to this pandemic. I would wish to pay tribute to public sector organisations. I spent 10 years as a councillor and I entirely recognise the amazing work they do. I would pay tribute to private sector organisations who have also stepped up for our country, and of course voluntary sector organisations. For me, it is not an either or, it is both, and what delivers the best outcome for the public. Anything less would, in my view, be letting down our constituents and letting down our public services.
Let's go to Angela Richardson. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the height of the pandemic, the contracts we signed allowed us to stand side by side with the private sector, procuring enormous volumes of goods and expertise with extreme urgency. Does my honourable friend agree that without these vital contracts, our COVID response would have suffered as a result?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree entirely. I mean, it reminds me slightly, some of the narrative around this, of my days back at school and Animal Farm, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. The reality is both private sector and public sector have played an incredible role in tackling this pandemic, for which we should be extremely grateful and thankful. We need both, and we need both to continue delivering in the public interest, which is what we have secured.
Let's go to Manchester with Debbie Abrahams. Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are a couple of points that seem to be coming up from this discussion. First of all, that there were no shortages of PPE. Well, patently, that's not true. We have clear evidence that that's the case, not least from exercise sickness back in 2016, but also from, for example, local constituents who have been working in the NHS who have reported this directly to me and colleagues. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, that the government has published all the contracts, and the Minister has made reference to 100% contract award notices being published. Well, unfortunately, we're not able to verify this. And that is the key point, also made by the NAO, who said that there's still £4 billion worth of contracts since November 2020, which we have no idea who they have gone to, how much for. So will the Minister once again please commit to publishing these VIP contracts, how much they were for, who they were awarded to, and what for?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and she and I have known each other a long time. She makes her point forcefully, but as ever, fairly. She raises a number of points in respect of PPE supplies, and as I made clear, I think, to the Honourable Lady for Brighton Pavilion, I made very clear that in the NAO report, I believe it was last November, they said there was no, it did not run out nationally, but that is not, as I've clarified, to say that there weren't local shortages and challenges in individual trusts, as I acknowledged to the Honourable Lady, the member for Brighton Pavilion, and that is why we procured as much as we could, as quickly as we could. She raised the issue of exercise sickness. I do have to say this comes up a number of times. However, it's important to remember exercise sickness did not look at tackling a novel COVID or a novel pandemic. It looked at flu, it looked at influenza specifically. The PPE required for dealing with a disease of the nature of COVID is very different to that for flu, and that exercise had as one of its predicated actions the swift arrival of antivirals to be delivered to tackle the flu. They did not exist in the case of COVID until much later. So it's important we learnt from it, but we should be careful about reading directly across as it representing a blueprint for how to tackle a pandemic of this sort. And her final point about transparency, as I've made clear, the government remains committed to transparency and to the publication of contracts as required under the regulations.
Right, let's head to Lincolnshire with Holly Mumbycroft. Holly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the height of first wave of the pandemic, we looked to the government to procure and to distribute tens of thousands of critical items of PPE in Scunthorpe. Does my honourable friend agree with me that moving forward, the government should of course remain committed to following all the detail of procurement rules? However, protecting our frontline health workers should always come first.
I agree entirely with my honourable friend. It shouldn't have to be an either or, but we all remember the conditions in which our amazing civil servants were working at pace back at the start of this pandemic. They were working flat out, including, as acknowledged in the court papers, civil servants who were not DHSC civil servants. They were seconded in from other departments working on different systems just to get that PP ordered and delivered to protect the front line, which was the priority. So it shouldn't be an either or, but she's absolutely right. At the height of that first wave, I believe it's absolutely right that the focus of those dedicated officials was on getting the PPE we needed.
Right, let's head to Wales with Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. I'm not an expert in public procurement, Mr. Speaker. However, even in an emergency, I would expect diligent contracts would include full payment on delivery clauses or clawback measures for failure to supply. He mentioned in an earlier reply that the British government is pursuing contractors who have failed to meet their obligations. How much public money has been regained to date? And will he ensure the House is updated on the government's efforts on recouping misspent public money?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right to highlight that where contracts do not deliver, either to standard or do not deliver, then public money should either not be paid or should be recouped. We are going through a number of investigations at the moment to deliver exactly that, and I am quite happy to commit that at the appropriate juncture we will, of course, update the House.
Let's head to Henley with John Howell. John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister accept that illegal acts are those that contravene the law, unlawful acts are those that contravene the rules? So handball in soccer is unlawful, not illegal. And will he accept the point made by the chairman of the Justice Select Committee that this is a technical breach and that it has been overcome and that the department is going out of its way to make sure that it happens quickly?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suspect I can do no better than to quote the judgment which stated that in respect of Regulation 50, the government acted unlawfully, but he's absolutely right to highlight the fact that, again, as the judgment set out, the Secretary of State is almost at complete compliance, and that is exactly what the government is committed to.
Let's head to the North East with Liz Twist. Liz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government claims that this is just a case of a few PPE contracts published a couple of weeks late. But in fact, we know that hundreds of millions of pounds worth of contracts also went to management consultants. So can the Minister confirm whether all these contracts, missing the publishing deadline at the start of the pandemic and up until now, were in fact for PPE, or whether they also included contracts that have gone to private consultants? And can you explain why those contracts were not published on time?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My understanding, in response straight answer to the Honourable Lady's question, is that this data relates to all contracts by the Department. If I am inaccurate in that, I will of course correct the record for the House, but my understanding is that this data refers to all contracts by the Department itself.
Let's head down the river to Stephen Metcalfe. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend confirm that all government contracts are awarded in a fair, open and transparent way, following the correct due process, and that this government remains committed to publishing them as quickly as possible, even under the pressure of this pandemic? And does he agree with me that the public are much keener that we address the real issues of the pandemic rather than engaging in political point scoring?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't agree with my honourable friend more, both about the government's commitment to transparency and to publishing contracts within the regulations, but equally his point about and reminding everyone about where we were a little under a year ago and the absolute focus by so many amazing and dedicated civil servants on getting the PPE we needed and getting it in quantity.
Right, let's head to Midlothian with Owen Thompson. Owen.
Mr. Speaker, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime says in its Recover with Integrity campaign that emergency responses must be anchored in law and be implemented by strong public institutions with the involvement and oversight of members of Parliament, anti-corruption bodies, civic society and private sector. It's clear honourable members have numerous questions over these contracts. So will the Minister now advocate such action, such as backing my